Perfect, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping to get through this relatively quickly and leave some time for questions. Budgets are always a tricky thing, so I'm just going to focus on best I can. So with this NIH budget presentation, I prepared it as a generalist sort of approach because we didn't have the FOA information at the time. With that having been released, I've looked at it and I'll try to point out a few key things where I can. As I had said yesterday in my previous presentation, I strongly encourage you all to have a look at that FOA. It is very detailed and useful, so it's just to have a look at that. But what I'm going to cover is just to get started with NIH budgets, the types of budgets that the NIH accepts, components of the budget, preparing it, as well as a few other considerations. These will all primarily focus on the pre-award section. I will have a touch very briefly on post-award, just so that you're aware of a couple of considerations there. Just in terms of getting started, just understand a few NIH cost principles. The NIH cost you can charge to NIH awards must be allowable in the first part. The unallowable costs are accessible. I haven't listed them here as they are relatively extensive, but it's just to be aware that not all costs are allowable. They are required to be reasonable or necessary as it relates to the project you're proposing. Local, or in other words, directly allocated to the project or the proposal that you are preparing. They need to be consistently applied as well as conform to NIH terms and conditions. Nice catch up. Another couple things just to be aware of. As I've already mentioned, read the funding opportunity announcements. Again, it's just to note that what has been released is very detailed and useful. A couple of key points there is just to make sure you're aware of the period of support. For the UO1 in particular, it's 5 years, so you're aware, and just the dollar limits that are applied for each year. It's specific for the UO1 as being variable per year, so just be aware you keep within those. A key point there is those limits apply to the direct costs, which means that it's only costs applicable to your project. Indirect costs or overheads are included over and above those annual limits. So just be aware of that. I'll come back to those so you're aware. Types of budgets, it's just to be aware that NIH accepts two, a modular or a detailed budget. I'm going to focus more on a detailed budget as this is typically what you'll be submitting. I will briefly touch on a modular budget though, so you're aware of what it is. And just right out there, another point to be aware of, but not applicable to these calls, is that if you're going to request more than $500,000 per annum, you require prior approval from the NIH. So just be aware of that. Again, I think I mentioned yesterday, but just keep note of the fact that you should ask any questions to the program officer. So as mentioned, there are two types of budgets applicable to NIH, one being modular. This typically applies to projects that are requesting less than $250,000 per annum. But I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, as I suggest we rather look at submitting a detailed budget. This will be uploaded through the R&R budget form, and as I mentioned again yesterday in my talk, I will cover this in some detail of what is required in ASSIST so that you are aware. The detailed budget should also, so it's essentially going to be a fairly clear breakdown of what you're going to request each year and should be prepared even if you do submit a modular budget, as it's useful to be quite aware and clear on what you're requesting per annum. It's just a note there of the types of awards that typically require a detailed budget, as not all NIH applications or schemes actually accept a modular budget. In terms of costs, I've touched on it already, direct costs. These are going to be directly allocated or attributable to the project. They include items such as salaries, along with fringe benefits if your institution has a fringe benefits policy. As a side note, UCT does not, so we do not request fringe benefits. We will include student fees, consultant fees, equipment costs, supplies, and travel. Your modified total direct costs, that's just to be aware of. This is what you will use to determine your facilities and administrative costs or indirect costs as indicated below. Some costs are excluded from this calculation. That includes items such as equipment, as well as some student fees are excluded from the total direct costs when determining your indirect costs. As indicated there, that's essentially your overhead or shared costs for your institution. And for foreign institutions, so we'll all be applying an 8% limit. US institutions have a negotiated rate with the government, and this differs by institution. The NIH will, however, not, with any of these collaborative awards, request any indirect costs. So that you're aware, in some instances, there are total cost limits, which effectively is your direct costs and the applicable indirect costs have to fit within that limit. Just so you know about that, but it does not apply to this scheme. So the budget is essentially broken down into sections A through H. I'm going to cover each section as best I can and try to go through each briefly so you know what they are and what to include there and which you shouldn't essentially use. To begin with, the sections A and B, which relates to personnel. This is your senior or key persons attached to the project, as well as any other personnel that will be required to carry out what you propose. It's just to note that you'll be indicating the time or effort of each individual. This is either provided in calendar or academic/summer months. I recommend using calendar months, as this is relatively easily determined by calculating or taking your full-time equivalents and multiplying that by 12 months. So as an example, if you're going to spend 10% of your time on the project, you would take 10% times 12, which in effect is 1.2 calendar months. And this is what you will use to determine the actual request for your salary. It's just an extra note there around the additional personnel required, be it co-investigators, as I mentioned, other personnel, being technicians, postdoc fellows, or any graduate students. You could also include administrative support within this category. When we have a look at the assist forms, we can show you in a bit more detail what that is. Just a few more points on personnel, so you're aware. Each person who is listed and is requesting a salary should have a specific role in the budget, or on the project rather. And what's important is that you try and be as realistic as possible as to what kind of time that person would have to commit. There was a question posed to me yesterday as to how we determine how many people should be included on a project. It's just a note that should be determined essentially by what the project requires, and there is no magic formula for this. And it's just to try and get an objective opinion, if you can, as to the number of persons that you've included. And as I say, outside opinion is always helpful there. The budget justification, I'm going to come to that again, but it's just to note here that if there are any fluctuations in the effort levels or staffing levels that you request in your project, be sure to explain this in the budget justification. An example would be if you include a research nurse on your project who's only required in years 1 to 3 during, let's say, participant recruitment. It's just to make sure you justify this in the budget, or if, say, for example, they're only required later in the project, that this is just explained and you don't leave it to the reviewers to try to figure out what actually is going on. It's just a note here on salary cap. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but in effect, the NIH have a salary cap of $197,300 per annum. Some salaries, and I mean, this is arguably more applicable to US institutions, but some salaries do exceed this limit, which the NIH expects you to list as the participant's base salary, as this does not actually factor into the calculation. But if your salary were to exceed this limit, you should list that. However, your time effort should be determined, or your salary request would be determined based on that salary cap. So it's just to be aware of that. There is a link included to the notice and describing that in a bit more detail if you want to go read that. So having looked at section A and B, we move on to section C relating to equipment. Equipment from the NIH definition is any item that is greater than $5,000 in value. Any other equipment that is less than $5,000 would be listed under the supplies category, which is section F. I will come back to that a bit later. However, one thing to note is if your institution has a policy whereby an equipment is considered an asset and it has a lower value in effect than $5,000, so again, as an example, UCT's asset definition includes any equipment over the value of 15,000 Rand. That could then be used as NIH-defined equipment. So just to be aware that your institution's policy does also come into this, as well as the NIH policy. Just a couple other related points. Most equipment would be requested in the first year. If you're requesting more equipment later in your project, just be sure to justify why this is so. As mentioned with personnel, justification is necessary for any equipment you need, and particularly as noted there, if there is similar equipment at your institution already. If you are requesting any large equipment that is particularly expensive, so let's say anywhere over $5,000 or close to $10,000 plus dollars, is include a quote if you can, as this just helps reviewers and the NIH staff with checking the validity of your request. So moving on to section D and travel. So it's just to note here that the information I've included is very generalist in nature as it relates to NIH application more generally and not the specific FOA. Having looked at the FOA announcement this morning, there are very specific requests in terms of travel to include, so be sure to check that as it relates to attending the steering committee meetings, etc. So just make sure you include the travel as requested in the funding opportunity announcement. But as a general sort of indicator, the NIH will typically support 1 to 2 meetings per year to essentially present any results from your studies. And those supported requests are relatively small in nature. So it's just to be aware that if you are including anything or requesting something that significantly exceeds this, as mentioned before, just be sure to justify this and why it is so. And if you need to include any travel for data collection, so essentially any project-specific activities, just be sure to highlight this within your justification so any reviewer or NIH staff is aware of what your request relates to. Section E of the budget, this is typically left blank. The only time to actually include detail here is if the funding opportunity announcement specifically requests it. So if there are any training costs that you're including, these would likely go into section F as indicated there, which is the other direct costs. So I'll highlight in a moment with the system where you can actually indicate that. But it's just to be aware that section E, you can essentially move straight through and not be bothered with including anything there. So section F is effectively all the other direct costs that relate to your project. So again, this is relatively general advice as to what the NIH look for and is not specific to the funding opportunities that you will be applying to. So just check again within the detail provided if there are any specific requests. But in general, the expectation is that per year you'll be requesting $12,000 to $15,000 per full-time equivalent. So that's if an individual spending 100% on the project, you would typically expect to see somewhere in the region of $12,000 to $15,000. So if there's obviously more than one individual spending 100%, then you would expect more. That's just a general guide. Further notes there is that if there are any animal-intensive studies or studies involving human subjects, as would likely be the case for the proposed projects here, they would expect to see a higher request in terms of your actual annual materials and supplies costs. So do be aware of that. If your studies are really only focused on in vitro or in silico-based studies, then those will typically be lower costs. So just use that as a general guide when you're preparing your budget in terms of whether or not your request will be seen as reasonable. Other costs to include there include publication costs, any costs for equipment maintenance and tuition fees, as well as any shared facility fees. So at your institution, there's a core facility that charges a fee. You could include that there. And it's also important to highlight any subcontract-based costs within the other direct costs area. Again, I'll point out where that is so that you have a sense of what to include there. There are also categories here that you can determine. There are only 3 that fall outside of the NIH-defined costs. So you can essentially give your own names to these. These might include something like ethics fees or participant reimbursements, or let's call it more just generally participant-based fees. So you can include additional costs here. You do, however, have a limit in terms of the number of categories you can actually cover. So budget justification, just to note, I did indicate earlier that there's section A through H. Section G and section H relate more to the indirect costs and the total cost requested per year. So you'll see that in a moment. But I just first want to touch on the budget justification, as this is a critical document to prepare and should not be overlooked and essentially be a short one-pager, because you need to justify everything that you've requested, specifically as it relates to personnel or any large equipment, or as indicated there, any unusual or large expenses. And It's also important to indicate in your budget justification if there are any subcontracts, what those values are per annum and overall, and split that out into both a direct cost and indirect cost request. So if you have multiple African partners on your project, be sure to highlight what you will be paying to each partner and what their indirect cost request is, as well as their direct costs. The actual justification for those costs would be loaded specifically into the sub-award form on assist, so there's a separate justification for each subcontract, so just be aware of that. And just to highlight there, that any over or underestimation of your budget, when you submit that for your proposal, suggests a lack of understanding in terms of the scope of work proposed. So, as we were discussing yesterday, leave time to develop your content for your application, but do not overlook the importance of the budget and leave it to last minute to cobble together. Try and do it simultaneously so you can do multiple iterations and get input on this, as you need to try and be as accurate as possible, given however there are slight estimations, but you want to be as close to what you're likely going to have to spend as possible. So this in a way takes us back to yesterday with Assist, and just, I had mentioned the brief budget that I covered there that I wanted to cover in more detail what's required on Assist. As this section can prove a little bit tricky, and there's just a few tips to share that should hopefully help you when completing this. Again, it's just to note that entering all the information here can take time. So when preparing a budget offline in an Excel spreadsheet, try and prepare it using the same categories and breakdown that the NIH uses in this budget spreadsheet as well, the budget form, as this will really help you with just translating those costs from a spreadsheet onto the online system, as opposed to trying to figure out what goes where. So just in terms of tips, so you'll note at the top there, I hope you can see it, that when you open the R&R budget tab, you're going to be met with period 1. So each year of the project is referred to as a period, and you'll only have a single period when you first access this tab. To add additional years and the costs related to that, you will add periods. A tip here, now, it's quite important to take note of this, is first complete period 1 fully before adding period 2. So don't add in advance period 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then go complete the information. The reason for that being is that when you add a period, it essentially copies all the detail that you've included in that period into the following period. So when you list all your key personnel or other personnel, that will be copied over under the assumption that those people will be involved in the project each and every year. So if you add each period beforehand without completing that detail, it just really increases the amount of time you have to spend in re-entering all that information. So be sure to first complete period 1, and once that's completed, save that period, and then add period 2. Then just in terms of the start and end dates, as a note there, this will relate specifically to the dates for project year 1, 2, 3, etc. So what you would indicate there, as it's shown in the FOA, the start date for your projects would be the 1st of April 2021. So for period 1, it would be 1st of April 2021, with the end date being the 31st of March 2022. Period 2 would be the 1st of April 2022, and then 31st of March 2023, etc. So it's just to be aware that those are what those dates are referring to, and not the overall project dates. Right, so this now brings up the respective sections that we've just covered in terms of ABC, etc. So it's just a couple of notes here to be aware of. I covered the points around calendar month and how to calculate that. It's just there as reference for you. So all the senior or key persons that you would include in this primary budget would specifically relate to your institution from where you're applying. Any collaborators that you're working with at other institutions would be listed in the sub-award budget. So the sub-award budget is a separate form. It'll look exactly the same as this. You can get your collaborators to complete this on your behalf. It's possible to download it as a PDF and send it to them, and then upload that PDF to this budget, and it will also populate the fields. So just be aware of that. The link to the sub-award budget is within this R&R budget form, so it will be clear where to add that. Just be aware of that, however. In terms of the other fields under senior persons or key persons, you don't have to complete all of them. There are, however, some that are mandatory, calendar months being one of them. The requested salary is another, so this would relate specifically to the request for that period. And you would indicate your fringe benefits. As indicated there, I suggest entering 0, as this is what applies at UCT. It's just to note, however, that that field does require a numeral to be entered, and if you don't enter something there, it will return an error. So be sure to enter something there, even if it is just 0. It's just to note that when you enter this form, the only individual that will be listed there is yourself as project PI. You'll need to add each other person at your institution through that add senior key persons link. And as mentioned, that should just be specific for your organization and not all the individuals on your project. For other personnel in section B, there are some predefined categories provided by the NIH. It's just to note, I think you can add an additional 6 categories of project roles to that form in section B. If you're finding you have more project roles that fall outside of what can be added, it's just to lump roles together and rather call it a generalist sort of term. So an example there would be as if you have administrative support you're including, be it a direct administrator or financial support. You could list them all under grants administration or research management support. It's just then within your budget justification is to flesh that out and explain exactly what those roles relate to and the request for each specific role. Just a note again about equipment being for items greater than $5,000, or if your institution has a separate policy related to that. So just to check that, items like computers typically would not go under here, but again, it might differ based on your institutional policy. So just check that, as that has implications for the indirect cost calculation. So moving on to travel, again, just a note there to skip section E. But moving on to travel, you will indicate all your travel costs under foreign travel costs, as none of the travel that occurs related to this project will be considered domestic. So it's just to note that your travel would likely be lumped as a single figure under period 1 or period 2, however it is. Again, it's just to flesh that out and explain what the relevant travel costs are within your justification. So hoping through this you can see the value and importance of the justification. Then moving on to section F, that's the other direct costs. So this relates to any other specific cost related to your project. And that you would list there in the predefined categories. The NIH has 7, and as mentioned earlier, there are 3 additional categories that you can use and complete. Again, you might have to lump costs together if it essentially ends up that way. So just use your discretion in that regard. If there are lump costs, again, justify it in the justification. In terms of indicating the sub-award costs, those will be listed there under 0.5. It's just to note that the total cost you should be listing includes both the direct and indirect costs. The costs that you request there would then be explained in further detail in the sub-award R&R budget. So again, hopefully just highlighting, this does take time to complete and you need to cross-reference that everything checks out, so be sure to give yourself time there. Then this comes down to other sections in the form. So section G is auto-calculated. That's just your total direct costs. That will auto-populate, won't be something you have to complete. Section H relates to your indirect cost request. Be sure to use this and include the 8% that's allowable for foreign institutions. You will have to either add the indirect costs. It's not auto-calculated. If you select that link there to add indirect costs, you'll be met with a pop-up that essentially has those 4 categories: cost type, cost rate, cost base, and the funds requested. You'll need to complete that. You can indicate the cost type as modified total direct costs. The rate would be 8%, as I say, fixed for foreign institutions. Your indirect cost base would be determined, as covered earlier, by the direct costs. Some might be excluded, like equipment or potentially any tuition fees. And then the funds requested for the indirect costs would essentially be entered based on 8% of whatever your modified total is. And then just the last note there is to upload your budget justification. The budget justification is a single document that is uploaded in period 1 only. You can save and complete your budget detail without uploading the budget justification. It's just will come up as we spoke about yesterday, that you'll get data verification messages and it'll probably pop up with an error. But just to know that any information that you do capture there will be saved until such time that you include your justification, which is required before you can submit. So just a few common errors, just to cover those, so you're aware, is exceeding the budget amounts provided on the funding opportunity announcements. So it's just important to go back and see what's allowable within year 1, year 2, and year 3, and make sure you don't exceed that. Just to note again that this is a direct cost limit, so your indirect costs are requested over and above that direct cost limit. Using a modular budget when a detailed budget is needed. As mentioned, I recommend a detailed budget, as this I think is more beneficial to work with. To make sure that your costs included in the budget are the same as what you list in the justification, just so that if you are breaking down a total request, that adds up to the same amount that you request in your budget. Do not exceed the salary cap, and make sure that your calendar month you request equates to the actual requested salary. Miscalculation of facilities and administrative costs at 8% is just to be aware that it doesn't include all direct costs, so be sure to review what you include as your request for indirects. And then again, I think we've reiterated it a fair few times, but be sure to make use of the NIH staff contacts, as they obviously are the experts in this area. Just a few other considerations. Just to note that the budget is not used by reviewers in assessing your scientific merit. However, it is discussed at the scientific review meetings, and it will essentially factor into the overall request. So it's just to be aware of that. It doesn't affect your scientific score, but it does come into the overall consideration of your project. So don't underestimate the importance of the budget, and be sure that you justify everything and make that clear, and don't overlook those requirements. A few other points to look at is just to make sure that the science drives the budget and justification and not necessarily the other way around. Be sure that you adhere to policies and practices of the NIH, and that insofar as possible your requests are reasonable and can be justified easily enough. As indicated, any large costs should be justified and made clear as to why it is that way. If there are any significant variations, highlight that. And then just the last note is when preparing your budget, if you will be spending in your local currency, be sure to use a conservative exchange rate and not a spot rate on the day. This is just to help protect against market corrections or essentially any fluctuations in your exchange rate. In South Africa, we have a relatively volatile rand versus dollar exchange rate. So if we use spot rates, we just run the risk of being at a budget deficit, given we'll always be awarded US dollars, but that may not equate to the same rand value on each and every day. So insofar as possible, use a conservative exchange rate and don't use spot rates. Now I'm just going to go through the notice of award very briefly, just a couple points on post-award, as I had wanted to focus more on the pre-award section. It's just to know that if you do receive a notice of award, so in effect, your proposal has been successful, to read that notice of award, as there may be differences between your original request and what the NIH will actually award. Make sure that you understand the terms attached to that, and if there are any restrictions based on costs or spending, be sure to adhere to those, and fit within the NIH funding regulations and policies. They are very strict, they are very strict in the way that you spend your money, so be sure to adhere to those. And if you do have any questions, if you're given an award, be sure to contact your program specialist or the program officer. And then our last couple thoughts, just to end off here, is if you do have changes during the course of your project, discuss those early. If there are any delays, know that you can potentially carry those forward as NoCost Extensions. Again, just make sure you can justify these and discuss early. Just a point to be aware, you would be receiving US taxpayers' money, and US taxpayers are interested in what happens to their hard-earned dollars. So just know that an award of around $1 million is considered a lot of money. So be careful where you spend it. And again, just reiterate, contact your program or grants management staff, as they can help you out if you have any issues. Just address those as early as possible. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David, for very detailed coverage of the topic. I know we are going toward the end of time, but I think there are important questions to be asked. So I'll go ahead and start with a few, if David, if you can help with. Number one, if you can clarify that the indirect cost is not automatically calculated. We have to calculate it outside the system and then plug it in. Is that correct? And then let's say for year one, for a new site, the cap is 100,000 USD. So we'll be budgeting for allowable costs for 100,000. And then we have to calculate ourselves 8% indirect, which is 8,000. Yeah. And then plug that in. Is that correct? Or are we just plugging in the direct and then the system automatically calculates the indirect and total? So that's one. At some point, you talked about tuition fees. We had discussions earlier, and it appeared NIH will only allow the research costs, but not the tuition fee for students. So can you clarify if this will be allowed or not? The other thing, you touched a bit on salary cap. If you can repeat a little bit to make it very clear what are the caps. The other question, yeah, the issue of percentage effort or calendar months. What are the caps for PI? Like a PI, how much minimum time must he or she devote to the grant? And the issue of investigators sharing time within sister grants in the current application, but also with other NIH grants. So what are the directives with regards to that? So David, if you can go ahead and answer those, and then I'll open the floor for other members also to ask.
Yeah, sure, thanks, Manuel. I'll try my best to remember everything. So in terms of the indirect costs, yes, you are correct. Those will have to be entered manually. And you are right in the sense that if we look at it very simply as $100,000 for year one being the limit, if those are the direct costs and you request them to the dollar, then the indirect cost request for that would be $8,000. And if you're going to have a piece of equipment that's $10,000, then your indirect cost rate will only be calculated off $90,000. So that would still have to go above the $100,000 limit, but it's just to be aware that there might be differences in terms of the cost base that you use. In terms of fees, look, as mentioned, the presentation I put together is relatively generalist, so they could be allowable. But if there is indication that the NIH would not allow those, then we'd have to follow their guidance on that. I haven't checked it specifically for this call, so I can't be too sure there. But as mentioned, it's important to just check with the NIH, and perhaps Shamian could speak to that one a bit more. Relating to your salary caps, so it's just to cover that again, the NIH have a salary cap that's applied, which currently sits at $197,000, $197,300. So you would in effect, let's say as a relatively simple example, if you were going to have a 10% FTE, your request would be $19,730. If, however, your salary worked out to $200,000 normally, you would indicate that as your base salary in Section A as $200,000. But when you determine what your actual salary request is, you would use the NIH cap. So it wouldn't be that your request is $20,000 at 10% FTE, even though you paid, say, $200,000 per annum. Your request would be $19,730 based on the NIH cap. Let me just try to see where. Do you just remind me of the last point, Manuel?
The last one was on percentage efforts.
Percentage, yeah, sure. So look, this would, in essence, need to be guided by each individual. You know, I don't quite have a stock answer that would apply to everyone, but you would typically look to contribute, say, between 10 and 20% of your time as a PI to a project. However, when you submit, and if you are invited, the NIH are going to want to see all the awards that you currently hold and your time commitments to those. They will then tally up what your total commitment is, and if you exceed 100% as a full-time equivalent, they're going to query how you will be able to manage this project. So it'll be important in determining what time you can commit to the project, what your current commitments are, and where you perhaps can reduce those if necessary, or how you can fit it in such that it wouldn't be problematic if you reach the award stage. I would, however, recommend that a PI of a project does commit time to a project, as it's obviously indicating that you are committed to running the project. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to request a salary commitment from the project. You could just be committing time to it, but it's just to be aware that your total time needs to be guided by what your current commitments are, and if those were reviewed, would you exceed 100% FTE, or could you fit within that limit?
Thanks much, David. So are there any additional questions from Ghana, from Nigeria, South Africa? Please just unmute and go ahead and ask.
Okay, so question from Nigeria. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, with the new arrangements, what kind of support will we receive from the Clinical Coordinating Center in terms of actually drawing up the budget? Because we used to have the budget template from the hub. So would that still be the case now, or we have to do it ourselves?
I'm not sure how to respond to that one.
From Hub? No response?
Yeah, it's substantial administrative support.
Hi, thanks very much.
Julie is here to respond.
Thank you very much for that.
So,
I do realize that this is an important thing, and the transition from hub to independent sites. I think the critical thing is that at the moment, each site will be developing their own budgets. The critical thing, or the thing that we can use or learn from the current budget, is to look at the templates, because we were using the templates that you were receiving to then upload it into the NIH system. So essentially, the same templates that you used, instead of sending them to us and then we upload them, you would be just uploading them directly into the system. So that's the way it would work. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Any additional question?
Hello?
Yes, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question relates to the percent effort. It's not an easy thing for some participants or investigators who work in government institutions that pay people 100% of their salary to actually calculate how much effort they will put on a research project, an external research project. Can you shed some light as to how people may manage that?
Look, I suppose it depends what roles we're talking about. I think as the PI, we covered that briefly. In terms of other support staff, in many ways is guided by the research proposal. If you are requiring staff to dedicate their time to the project 100%, then this should be included and justified clearly. If, however, you're trying to include staff that it's difficult to justify their role in the project at 100%, it would need to be essentially gauged down. The NIH and review staff would pick this up. So it is a tricky one. It's a difficult one to answer in a way without saying specifically what the situation is and what current commitments are and what essentially future commitments are. But as general guidelines, as I've indicated, it is largely essentially directed by the project. So I know not a great answer in terms of actually providing you with any concrete detail, but it's an easier thing to try and establish once we have a better idea of what staff you're referring to and what the actual project is and what the project requires.
I think that's a really good question, Kof, and it's very pertinent, especially when a lot of the activities are integrated very much with staff or with personnel who have full-time jobs in either hospitals, health facilities, or universities. And I think, as David said, maybe Ambrose can comment on this with regards to what UCT does. But I think from the experience with projects in Muhimbili University as an example, and this is, I think, what is similar with a lot of other projects, it's really for there to be transparency with regards to the level of effort as well as the additional, quote unquote, the additional income that is received from research projects. So different institutions, so it might be worth looking within your institution to see, or your country to see what the regulations and policies are. So as an example, in MUHAS or with government ministries of health, as long as it's clarified and your level of effort does not interfere, if it makes sense with your full-time job. So I don't know if I can try and say this. So for instance, if you have a doctor who is seeing patients in the clinic, and then in addition to seeing patients in the clinic, they're also collecting data as part of Sparko collaborating site, then this is something that most hospitals have a way of knowing how this will be calculated and how people will be reimbursed, and up to a certain amount, up to a certain proportion, and then beyond which they then will have to kind of handle it differently. So I think look at it within your countries, look at it at institutional level, look at it at national level, and also there's a lot of experience with existing programs, whether they're HIV programs, research programs, all that are funded by the NIH or other agencies, for you to know what is the best way. Once you know, and there's a huge range, a huge variation, once you know, then you're able to calculate this. I hope that's helpful and is pertinent to Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania.
Thanks,
Yes,
Julie, for clarification. Thanks very much, David. As you go, maybe one last question, and if you cannot answer it, maybe we'll discuss it in the consortium. So for the issue of satellite sites, are they going to be treated as sub-awardees or not? We need to discuss, because the satellites differ very much. Some are very they may not meet the NIH requirements. So what is the directive for U01s? Should we go the direction of sub-awardees or just stick to single awards? So if you can help with that, David, if you have thoughts.
Sure, Manuel. I think that's something that in many ways by site is required to do. I think if they are going to struggle to meet NIH requirements in terms of financial management, it may make more sense for essentially your host institution to manage the award and pay out the fees, as it were, whether it be as a consultant fee or potentially if there are any consumable costs, is that it is essentially purchased through your host institution. But it's again a slightly difficult one for me to answer without knowing the exact context and what sort of role each site is going to play. So that would be my sort of initial general advice. But I think it would need to be reviewed and just checked essentially once you're actually a little bit further along in developing a budget.
Thanks. I think very informative. Please, a round of applause to David.